Bonjour, comment ça va? Alors aujourd'hui, nous commençons la deuxième leçon du chapitre 4. Il y a deux points de grammaire aujourd'hui, à la page 156 du livre texte et à la page 159 du livre texte. La grammaire à apprendre, l'emploi du passé composé et l'imparfait. So for this lesson, today's lesson, it's assuming that you read the two uh, the two sections on avant la première leçon et avant la deuxième leçon. Basically, how to conjugate verbs in the passé composé and imparfait. Um, in this lesson, though, we're going to start using them to describe things that are happening in the past. So this assumes that you know how to conjugate verbs in both tenses. So let's begin with the first page, page 156. L'emploi de l'imparfait. Both the imperfect and the past tense are used to describe events that are in the past. There are other tenses too, which you will learn in the next lesson. But how do you distinguish which one to use? Well, we'll find out with an example story. First and foremost, make sure that you do read all the bullet points in the textbook over these two grammar points because each and every one of them are different. However, in this video, I'm going to generalize most of them, and some of the others we won't be using in class, and it will not be on the exam. But it's good to keep these in mind as well if you're going to use French later on in 202. So the imperfect tense has one basic rule. The imperfect tense is used to describe things that are happening in the background, to describe a scene, for example, in a story or in a play. A lot of people in theater, they usually narrate what is going on in the background of a story before it actually begins, to just kind of set up the story and the scene. And so, one way to do that is to provide information, and the way you do that is to put it in the imperfect tense. So one way to describe background information, a perfect example, is what's going on the day of a car accident. You'll have to forgive me on how I draw these pictures, but so if you're describing to somebody like a police officer what was going on in the scene of an accident, and they ask you what was going on before you got into the accident, you can say, Moi, je conduisais à l'université, alors j'étais à l'université, il faisait du soleil ou il faisait bon, et moi, j'étais dans la voiture et je conduisais au campus. So all of those events are in the not passé composé, but imparfait because they're just describing what was going on. Now, part B on page 157 lists a couple of other circumstances in which you use the imperfect tense, but we're not going to be concentrating on those in this class. So the only thing to keep in mind is background information with imparfait. So turn to page 159. The second grammar point is when to use the passé composé. Now going back to our example of describing the scene of a car accident, you describe everything else in the imperfect tense. However, for example, in an accident, when something changes and it already has been done, then you would narrate that event in the passé composé. So the keywords to keep in mind here in the passé composé is you put things in the passé composé to describe actions that are complete, okay, that have been completed, or actions that change something or someone's state of mind, okay, that changes that entity one way or another. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person, but most of the time it is. Okay, so after the accident, you were driving, je conduisais, et tout d'un coup, soudainement. Okay. J'ai été. J'ai été un accident de voiture. J'ai été un accident de voiture avec un homme qui, qui apportait son vélo. Qui apportait son vélo. Là-bas. Qui apportait son vélo. So, changing the scene from scene A, okay, everything was tranquil, to scene B, okay, whatever actions changes scenes are automatically in the passé composé because they do change. For example, how my car was, and then now how my car is. And also, it's also other things. When you narrate things in the imparfait to describe what's going on in a scene, you can list as many things as you want. For example, okay, all of a sudden, you got into a car accident. J'ai été en accident de voiture. Il y a beaucoup de peuple. J'étais choquée, j'étais surprise. L'homme était choqué aussi. L'accident était horrible, par exemple. C'était horrible, c'était très terrible. Okay, a lot of these bullet points on page 159 also describe uh, events that should be narrated in the passé composé, but most of them can be generalized with the idea that you use the passé composé to describe changing scenes, changing states of mind, what else? Completed actions, for example, series of events, just like the accident. And if you turn to the next page on page 160, once you get comfortable with using the imperfect and the passé composé, and you have a fairly good idea of when to use each one, then you come with then you come into the part where there are verbs that change meaning when you conjugate them in both the imperfect and the passé composé. So there are three verbs listed on page 163: to know, to be able to, and to want. Savoir, pouvoir, and vouloir. Now, it's one meaning to put them in the imperfect tense, but it's another meaning when you put them in the passé composé. As you can see, je savais means I knew. J'ai su in the passé composé actually means I found out. Finding out as in changing in state. So that's why they put in the passé composé. Before you didn't know, je savais, and then all of a sudden now you know. So j'ai su, that you would put in the passé composé. Same goes for the other two. Pouvoir, je pouvais, I succeeded in. J'ai pu, I was just able to. If you have a hard time distinguishing between the two, I was just able to. Je voulais, I wanted to. J'ai voulu, I tried to. And then if you negate that, je n'ai pas voulu, it means I refused to. Okay, wanted to is usually the one that's mostly used. Je voulais. J'ai voulu, I tried to. Okay, I had the intention of, but all of a sudden I don't want to anymore, so it's a change in state. Besides these three verbs, there are also two other important verbs that do change meaning between the imperfect and the passé composé, and they're actually the two most commonly used verbs in French, être and avoir. So let's start with être. Let's take these two examples right here. J'étais malade, and then j'ai été malade. Which one do you think means I got sick? The bottom one, j'ai été malade means I got sick because remember that passé composé means change in state. So before you were feeling good, and then now all of a sudden you're sick. So you have to put that in the passé composé. J'ai été malade versus I was sick, which is used to describe what's going on in the past. Okay, I was sick versus I got sick all of a sudden. Okay, the other one I did say is avoir. J'avais faim et j'ai eu faim. Which one means I was hungry? The first one, j'avais faim. I was sick, meaning, you know, I'm just describing, okay, letting you know that I was sick at that time. Versus j'ai eu faim, just like with j'ai été malade, means I got hungry. J'ai eu faim. All of a sudden, before I was not hungry, and now all of a sudden I am. So I got hungry. J'ai eu faim. So this is the one thing that most students have a hard time grasping. But when you translate them to I was to I got, then it actually becomes very, very clear to you. Uh, Last but not least, on page 161, there's an example story for you to read in French, obviously, with verbs that are conjugated in either the imparfait and the passé composé. I do recommend reading this just so that you can distinguish when to use both tenses, because it does show up on the exam, and you do have to know when to use both tenses appropriately. So make sure that you do that, as well as the other activities and the homework. If you have any questions, make sure that you let me know. The concepts of the two past tenses are very hard to grasp, even for French speakers. But we we do eventually have to learn uh, later on as we continue to learn French. So if you're going to go on to 202, the one thing that you do need to know is how to conjugate the two past tenses. So make sure that you do have a good foundation of it now before you move on. Okay, merci et au revoir, bonne journée.